Thank you everyone for being here with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. We know how busy everybody is, and for you to be here with us at this time of night, we really appreciate it. We are going to be talking about DD services. It's a Q&A with Lisa and I, and we are really excited about this presentation. So I am Jen Miller, and I am the Executive Director at PTI Nebraska, and I will let Lisa take it away.
All right. I am Lisa Habza. I am the Family to Family Health Information Outreach Coordinator at PTI Nebraska. I've been here for about a year. And over the course of that year, I think right out of the gate, questions started coming in about DD waivers and DD services and this list that everybody needs to get on. So we have fielded those questions, kind of made a master list of what most parents are asking and what they need information about. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to have you put any questions that might come up during the presentation into the chat. And Jen will go ahead and ask those questions of me afterwards. But we'll just run through these general questions with the answers to get started. I always like to start out a little bit about what is PTI Nebraska, just because some people get referred to this presentation but don't actually know who we are or what we do. We are a statewide resource for families of children with disabilities and special health care needs. With that being said, we also do provide information to professionals as well. We want you all to know that we are staffed with parent professionals. So everyone right now that works at PTI Nebraska also has a child with a disability or a special health care need. So we have oftentimes sat on the other side of these presentations as well. So no question is a dumb question, and we don't have all the answers, but we're always happy to investigate them for you. We conduct workshops and presentations like this across the state. Our office is located in Omaha, but we serve the entire state. We have tons of printed and electronic resources that are absolutely free that we can send out to you. We try to encourage parents to take a leadership role in their students' education or their individual in their healthcare. We also provide a lot of one-on-one support to families who have kiddos with complex medical conditions or disabilities. Like I said, I'm the Family to Family Health Coordinator. So that means we receive a federal grant to operate this health information center kind of separately from the PTI. So I focus mostly on everything healthcare, whether it's inside of the schools or inside of the medical community, and obviously accessing state and federal benefits through the government.
All right, so we're going to start with our questions, and hopefully you guys get some good information. So first, Lisa, lots of just general questions about what is this DD waiver? What's the waiver?
Well, most people, when they call, they don't say, what is the waiver? They say, I need to get on the list.
Oh.
Somebody told me about this list that I need to get on.
Okay.
Yeah, so the list is actually the DD waiver. It's the Medicaid Home and Community-Based Service Waiver that allows the state of Nebraska to use federal Medicaid funds for services in the community. So these aren't really medical services, but they're supports for daily living. I like to tell a lot of parents they're kind of like taking over the place of the school district and those daily supports that the schools offer you. So this can look different for a lot of individuals. It might be in an adult daycare setting. It might be supported work in a workplace. The waiver can offer home modifications, respite hours, transportation, just a variety of services to help an individual that's transitioning into the adult community live as independently as possible.
So a lot of parents here, to be eligible or to qualify, there needs to be some sort of developmental disability. So we often get the question, okay, so what is a developmental disability?
So a developmental disability, by definition, is a group of conditions that cause an impairment in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas that impact your day-to-day function. This does not include mental illness. Normally it happens, well, it does happen in the developmental period before the age of 22, and it's often believed to be lifelong. It causes substantial problems in your mental or physical functions daily, and oftentimes you need special supports to be able to carry out activities of daily living. A lot of times it's easier for parents to think about that, what a developmental disability is and how, if your child may or may not have one. So their limitation areas are broken into 3 separate skill sets: practical skills, conceptual, and social skills. So that can look different for each individual. Some individuals need help with personal care and mobility, where some have more cognitive deficits or social skills. They are more gullible. They lack personal awareness. They don't have any social problem solving skills. They're unable to understand and follow what we consider regular laws and rules.
I like this because it kind of breaks it down, helps you think about it a little bit further.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so after that question about developmental disability, the next question a lot of parents have, they read on the website or information that there could be an intellectual disability. So what is an intellectual disability?
They're pretty much the same, because an intellectual disability is a type of developmental disability, and describes those who have more of cognitive difficulties, such as problem solving and memory. And oftentimes people with an intellectual disability have a sub-average intelligence. So I just most commonly, as an individual ages and becomes more adult, they kind of just transfer words and it's no more a developmental disability, because that's like old news. Now we just have a general intellectual disability as an adult.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good to know. All right, so we get this question, goes along with those first ones. So if my child has a mental health condition, is that considered a developmental or intellectual disability?
No, a mental health condition alone doesn't qualify your child as having a developmental or intellectual disability. But oftentimes, those who have a mental health condition also have some sort of intellectual or developmental disability going along with that. So sometimes the pairing of the mental health condition and maybe another diagnosis would qualify, but not just alone. A mental health condition would not qualify you.
Along those same lines, so are there any conditions or disabilities that would automatically qualify a child or young adult for DD services?
The answer is no. Oftentimes we get a lot of phone calls that says my child has Down syndrome or autism or some of those common diagnoses, and they're like, well, everybody I know that has autism qualifies. And I was like, well, that's not necessarily true. There's such a wide array of the skill sets with individuals with those diagnoses that they don't automatically qualify. Again, it's going to be into that individual's actual deficits that they're taking into a consideration.
All right. No automatic. Gotcha. So when do I apply for an adult day waiver?
So the adult day waiver is the DD waiver. And we tell parents to apply as early as possible, but most commonly they start to really hit it home about the age of 14, because that is the age of transition in the state of Nebraska. We really suggest you start that paperwork then. Right now in the state of Nebraska, the waiting list for services is about 7 years. So you want to serve your time early before you actually need those services, before your child's actually out of school. So once you're applying at the age of 14, so your question might be, when do services begin? For this adult day waiver, they don't begin until you graduate high school or that you've reached the age of 21. You have to be eligible for DD services and the funds have to be available. And like I said, you have to serve your time on the waiting list. Oftentimes a service coordinator will reach out about 60 or 90 days before the individual's 21st birthday to start planning on what those services can look like and what funding is available for your individual.
So I've heard DD services are for adult services, but are there child services as well?
Yes, there are actually 2 different types of the developmental disabilities waiver. There's an adult waiver, oftentimes referred to as the DDAD, And that is for people ages 21 and older. And that focuses a lot on employment and independent living. There is also a CDD waiver, and that's the Developmental Disabilities Comprehensive Waiver, and that's available to people of all ages.
All right, so a couple questions with the applying. So can a guardian apply for DD services on behalf of a child?
Yes, as long as it's a legal guardian, they can apply for services.
Okay, so can a foster parent apply for DD services on behalf of a child?
There's lots of different instances of being a foster parent. So if the child is placed into foster care and is a ward of the state, the DD application should be filed by the Children and Family Services, but a lot of times that's in conjunction with the foster parent that has more experience, has spent more time with the individual child, that can answer a lot of the questions more in detail. But actually, it should be filed by Child and Family Services.
Okay, so whatever kind of group organization that the foster parent's working with,
Yep.
get with them and then
Yep.
discuss the, okay, gotcha. Okay, so how do I apply for these DD services?
It's actually easy, and you can go old school and fill out a paper application. They have those available on the DHHS website. Otherwise, you can reach out to us at PTI Nebraska, and we can shoot it to you in the email or through snail mail or whatever you prefer. There is also an electronic application at accessnebraska.com, which at PTI we have developed kind of a tool to kind of help you find where the application is buried. Sometimes Access Nebraska is like just too much for parents because they use that system to apply for, Medicaid, food stamps, a lot of other programs too. But we do have a tip sheet that we can include with this presentation when we send it out afterwards that'll kind of help you navigate that system if that's what you prefer to do.
So with that application, I'm guessing there's paperwork. So what kind of paperwork is involved in this whole DD services application process?
The application itself is not really too bad. I'd say it's maybe 2 pages long. So that part of the paperwork is pretty simple in comparison to some other options that parents have to fill out. So the application gets submitted. You receive a phone call 7 to 14 days after submitting your application for a phone interview, and you're going to discuss your child's skills and abilities a little bit more in depth so that caseworker can understand what the needs are of your child. This is where a lot of families have most of their issues applying for DD services. A lot of parents enter kind of maybe like a grieving or a sadness, just because we really want you to focus on the skills that your child does not have and what they need help with, rather than focus on the things that they can do. And in the education system, a lot of times we're like, yeah, they can do one part of a skill set. There's also documentation that needs to be sent with that. So if you want to save a little bit of time in the application process, you can collect those documents yourself, which would be any assessments conducted by a psychologist or a psychiatrist, diagnosis of the disability before the age of 22, and how it affects the ADLs, and all school reports such as MDTs, IEPs, and that information. And you can present that. Otherwise, DHHS will reach out to your contacts that you provided on your application and collect that information for you. So you can do really as little or as much of the information gathering as you want.
So heard something about nursing home level of care. Not quite sure, but does my child need to meet some kind of nursing home level of care to qualify for these DD services? And, if they don't meet that, should I even apply for these?
I tell parents always, yes, if you're in doubt, apply. You just never know. My interpretation of something might be different. My understanding of the instructions and the eligibility requirements might be misunderstood. So I always encourage parents, apply. You don't want to miss out on something just because you're hesitant. It doesn't cost anything to apply, but a little bit of your time. But as far as this nursing home level of care, You don't have to meet a nursing home level of care. It's a participant must have a developmental disability and meet the need for intermediate care facility. And those are oftentimes for people who have developmental disabilities. Intermediate care facilities are often confused with skilled nursing facilities, but intermediate care typically doesn't focus on medical services, but more are for rehabilitative assisted living. So they house people that need more of a daily assistance and occasional monitoring to be able to live safely.
Okay, that's good to know because parents hear these kind of things and then they're not sure. And maybe they don't apply because they don't think that their child would meet that criteria. All right, so after I apply, how long of a wait before I will hear if my child qualifies for DD services?
And that goes back to a little bit about how much of the legwork you do for them. So if you've collected all the documentation from your doctors and your school and presented it to them, it's going to speed up the process a little bit rather than them reaching out to those facilities and waiting to get a reply. Normally, families hear back within about 30 days, but it could take up to 90 days. And that is after all the documentation is received. So not the beginning of the process. So the quicker you are to answer phone calls, to schedule the interview, to help with the process of getting documentation in, it'll move a little bit quicker. But just because your child is found eligible doesn't mean they're going to receive services right away. There is limited funding available. And so then people are like, so then why do I have to apply early? Well, because of the waiting list. And eligibility is going to be reviewed again at ages 9 and 18, just to make sure that you still meet that criteria. And then if Social Security ever determines that your child is not disabled, the eligibility is going to have to be reviewed by DHHS again.
Okay, again, words matter. And
Words
parents
do
hear
matter.
all sorts of things. So lots of parents are told, I need to get my child on a waiver. Are DD services and waivers the same thing? Are they related?
They are in essence the same thing. The thing that you're applying for is actually a waiver program for Medicaid. So it is the Developmental Disabilities Waiver, which provides the DD services. So the waiver is what you're applying for that provides the services.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Absolutely.
All right, so you've mentioned that waiver. So what is a Medicaid waiver?
So a Medicaid waiver allows the state to use federal Medicaid funds for services in the community. So that's outside of your regular doctor, dentist visits. It's using those services for transportation, for respite hours, for maybe a day program for your individual.
So what does Medicaid pay for then?
Well, it depends. Medicaid benefits are going to depend on the need of the individual and what the waiver program or individual qualifies for. So those benefits and what they pay for look a little bit different for each individual, and that is totally needs-based.
So how many Medicaid waivers are there in Nebraska?
In the state of Nebraska, there are 4 Medicaid waivers. Most commonly, we hear about the A&D waiver, the aged and disabled waiver. I feel like sometimes this one gets left out because we think our kids aren't old, but it is for a person of any age. And this is where you get more into the person can live at home, but they must have a physical and healthcare need that requires the nursing level care. So oftentimes these individuals have maybe G buttons, they might have tracheostomies and other needs that need to be met by a nurse, their medical needs. The next one is the Comprehensive Developmental Disabilities Waiver. Again, that one allows people of all ages with developmental disabilities to maximize their independence to live, work, socialize, and participate to the fullest extent possible in their communities.
I want to thank you for those explanations because in that first one, the A&D nursing facility level care, some parents might hear about that and think, oh, and if that's the only waiver they hear about or are told about.
And they just get all jumbled up. So there's again that DD waiver for adult services. Those are for people 21 and over that have developmental disabilities. And again, it's to maximize their independence as they live, work, socialize, and participate in their community. And then we do have a fourth type of waiver, which is the traumatic brain injury waiver. And this provides a person from ages 18 to 64 with an acquired brain injury. It is oftentimes from injury or maybe an illness like meningitis that causes some brain damage. And this is allowing those people waiver services to live in assisted living, but they do have to have a diagnosis of a traumatic brain injury.
So who decides which waiver my child should be on?
Well, it will depend on what waivers you apply for and what level of care your child needs and what they qualify for. So I encourage parents to apply for anything that your child may qualify for. My daughter, for instance, qualifies for both the A&D waiver and the DD waiver. She has medical needs that need to be met, and she has an intellectual disability. And so while my daughter can qualify for both, I cannot receive services on both. I just need to look at what services are provided under each waiver and make the decision what best fits my family.
Is there a wait list for DD services or waivers or both? And you mentioned that earlier, but I want to hear about that again.
So for DD services, for adult services, there is approximately a 7-year wait list. And some people wonder why that number never changes. It never changes because as fast as we're serving these individuals, there's that many more adding to the list. So we're staying pretty consistent at 7 years. Now for something like the A&D waiver or the traumatic brain injury waiver, there are currently no wait lists for services for those. But again, you got to apply for what you need.
So to qualify for Medicaid, is there some sort of financial requirement?
Yes. For Medicaid, there is a financial requirement, and that's going to be totally dependent on your family size and again, in which state you live in. So we have different coverage options state to state and different financial requirements state to state.
So I've heard some parents say that we make too much money for our child to qualify for services. So what are they talking about when they say that?
So their family income exceeds the financial allowance to qualify for Medicaid on a financial basis. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't qualify for services. And that's why those waivers are created. And sometimes that's how information gets disseminated through the telephone system that us parents use. So even though we got to apply for Medicaid and we need to be accepted or denied on a financial basis first. But if you really believe that your kiddo qualifies and needs the services that are listed underneath the A&D or the DD waiver, you just need to work through some systems to find your child disabled to qualify for that waiver, and then they will become eligible for Medicaid based on their disability.
Thought of something else that parents ask. So with that financial requirement, is that based on a child's age? So younger kiddos or young adult, like, is it always based on the family, or is it ever based on just the young adult? Does that make sense?
Yep. So in the state of Nebraska, the age of majority is 19. So once your kiddo or young adult reaches the age of 19, the family income no longer comes into play. It is just on the income of that individual. So at 19, your family income no longer matters.
Okay. And thought of one more thing that parents ask. You gave a good explanation about that number 21, about if parents say I make too much money and what that looks like and what they should do and see if they can work through that. What if it just comes out that they're not able to work through it? Can they still get services in any other way? Like, can they pay for it themselves, or is there any type of options like that?
There is a private pay option should you still need those services. And so then you could meet with a services coordinator and see what you could make work for your family. Again, either hiring an independent provider or using a community facility to meet the needs of your family.
But that's paying on your own.
Yep, that's paying out of your pocket.
But I guess it's good to know that that's there, that at
Yeah.
least a parent can ask. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you for answering my extra questions.
Sure.
Okay, so what can I do if found ineligible for DD services?
I always tell parents at first that on their denial letter, there is always up in the top corner the name and number of the person who reviewed your application. I always suggest that they reach out to this person because they can explain why the individual was not found eligible. And most times we find that it is an error, either in how we described our child's abilities or disabilities during that interview, or in our school and medical records. It's lacking enough information to give that person a clear picture of what our individual is capable of. So a lot of times we talk to that person, we kind of reach out to PTI Nebraska, we can help, we can kind of look through those paperwork and talk about your interview questions. And then we just go ahead and reapply. So start all over again. I tell people plan to get found ineligible the first time because we all do it wrong. So don't be discouraged. Just we'll go ahead and reapply. And again, if we're denied services again, there is an appeal process.
All right, so what happens next? So what happens if my child does qualify for DD services?
Well, our favorite word here at PTI Nebraska is it depends. It's going to depend a lot on your age, your need, and your priority status. So if I went and filled out my application and my kiddo's only 8 years old and I applied for adult services, I'm just going to be placed on the waiting list.
Mhm.
But maybe I have a greater need and I can meet one of these priority statuses, I might be receiving services earlier. So a lot of times that's immediate crisis, maybe becoming homeless or losing the primary caregiver. Sometimes people are placed in an institutional or hospital setting for a lengthy period of time, and they need to go back into that community-based living. So they'll qualify for services to kind of make that transition. State wards coming out of foster care, the juvenile justice system are priority status. Again, adults transitioning out of that educational system at the age of 21. Military dependents, and then basically it goes about time served on the waiting list. It kind of just depends on where you're at in the process.
Okay. Gotten this question from several parents over the years. So, why did my child not qualify for DD services, but my friend's child did? And my child would be considered more severely disabled than hers, or we think my child has more needs than hers. So, like, how did that happen?
Well, I most of the time tell my families it's probably human error. You could have answered any of those questions during the interview process incorrectly. You didn't accurately describe those abilities and disabilities correctly during the interview. A lot of times, especially during the developmental period and the educational years, we're taught to celebrate any little steps in the right direction, any little progress there. Where when we're filling out these applications, we're really focusing now on the deficits instead of the abilities. And that's really hard for us parents to do and to realize. So it's kind of, entering another grieving process, another like, oh, wow, so and so really can't do that. You could need to access services through another waiver. So maybe you applied for the DD waiver, but maybe your kiddo has more of the A&D need and they need more of those medical services and they have more of a physical need. Otherwise, us parents get busy and we don't follow up on the process. And if you're not continuously answering the letters, emails, phone calls, and staying current on the process, they're just going to straight deny you. They might reach out for the interview a time or two, send you an email that they've been trying to reach you. You don't reply in a timely manner, and they just go ahead and deny you and move on to the next person.
I'm glad that you pointed that out about the interview questions and the answers. I experienced that with the interview with my own son. I just have one example. There was a question about, can he feed himself? And I get so excited to tell people that he can pick up a spoon and he's a spoon master, and he can, get that food on that spoon and feed himself. And it's amazing. But when you think about that skill for this interview, I remember the services coordinator talking to me. Remember her saying, I need you to think about this in a different way. What can he feed himself? What if you weren't there? Could he get the food? Could he cook, or could he, prepare something? Can he put it in the plate? Can he bring it to the table? Then can he eat independently? Like, what if you weren't there? And that changed the question for me. That changed my answer. I celebrate how his awesomeness in spooning that food. But then I had to say, no, he's not able to cook or prepare his own food. He's not able to put his food on his own plate. I bring it to the table. I have to cut it up small because there's choking hazard. And then, yes, then he can take a spoon and he can eat, not able to use a fork very well, but so everything's spoon. But then I monitor him for choking hazards. So I'm near him, and then help take the plate to the sink. And so the service coordinator said, okay, so think of that with all the questions. You got to think of that. She goes, I know you want to celebrate your son, and you can tell me about that later. Right now, you need to focus your answers on if you weren't there, or I think she said something like his worst day with no help. Could he do these things? And I said, oh my gosh, my answers are different now. So I'm glad that you clarified that and brought that up again. So what does a DD caseworker do?
Well, for DD, they don't really have caseworkers. They are services coordinators. So they help you access those services and kind of how they're all going to work together to meet the needs of the individual. But for Medicaid actually uses caseworkers to manage the Medicaid funds. So actually, there's no such thing as a caseworker.
Gotcha. So does that service coordinator, can they help with my child's education at all?
They don't help with your child's education, although you can use them as part of your team. You can invite your service coordinator to attend your child's IEP meetings. You just have to ask your school to invite them. This will allow your service coordinator to provide information and help the team plan for adult services, especially in that transition period after 14. And then your service coordinator really gets to hear the team talk about your child and their interests and goals, and paints a better picture for the future. So when you get into planning those adult services, they have a pretty good idea of what your child likes to do and what they're able to do.
So I always say 8 heads is better than 1, right?
Yep.
So what kind of services can my child get through the waiver?
Well, services are dependent upon the specific waiver program, and then again on your needs. So with this presentation that we send out afterwards, the DHHS does a nice job. They have like a worksheet. So they outline all the different waiver programs and what services are provided under each waiver. So you can kind of look through yourself to see what the waivers provide. They're all just a little bit different. And then again, it'll depend on the needs, but things like transportation, home or vehicle modification, respite time, adult day services. There's just a wide variety of options, and they're mostly focused on, again, that independent living and work.
That handout sounds really good. So if I look at that handout and look at the different services provided under them, if I have questions about them, would I go back to the service coordinator and ask about, tell me about day services?
You can. Otherwise, you could reach out to PTI Nebraska, and one of us can kind of talk through those with you. Just like anywhere, they're a little short-staffed and going through high turnover. So sometimes the caseworker doesn't exactly know what those all are. And there's such a wide variety of services. A lot of times it's nice to go and just actually visit some of the centers or talk to people that are actually utilizing the services to kind of see what that looks like.
Can I pick and choose which services my child will get through the waiver?
You can pick what services you want to use. You don't have to use them all,
Okay.
but they're going to provide an assessment to see what your child qualifies for. So you don't really get to decide like, oh, we need this. I mean, they'll be assessed and see if there's a need for it. But you can
Okay.
pick out like what that looks like in the community and how it will be carried out.
Oh, okay. You mentioned this, but is respite available through the waivers?
It can be. Again, it's going to be dependent on the individual needs and where that individual resides. So respite is meant for a break for the primary caregiver. So if you live in a shared living environment and maybe there's different caregivers coming in and out of the facility, no, there wouldn't probably be respite provided. But say you're an adult living at home with your parents, then if there is that need, respite can be provided through the waiver programs.
Okay, yeah, we get quite a few questions about respites. So how long do DD services last through a waiver?
Typically, they last the lifetime of the individual, but they are reviewed for eligibility, typically on an annual basis or when there's a change in the circumstances. And at any time, if Social Security were to find you not disabled, the department's going to be notified and they're going to have to reevaluate that case.
Okay, so they are reviewing the eligibility to make sure your child or your young adult still is at that level of care, still has those needs, still needs those supports.
Yeah, they kind of reach back out at that age of 9 and 18, about adult age.
All right, so how much funding will my child get through the waiver? Like, how is that decided?
The funding will depend, our favorite word at PTI. The DD service coordinator completes an assessment to determine the needs, and then that funding amount is given based on what is needed to fulfill those needs. So obviously a person that has higher needs is going to receive more funding than somebody that maybe doesn't need quite as many supports.
Okay, so we get some parents hear about a priority one designation. So we get questions about that. So this was a question from a parent not that long ago. I was told to ask for my child to be considered for priority one designation in order to get DD services quicker. Like, is this true? Could this happen?
It could happen. I would not say that it's common because again, we go to that priority level. So priority level or status or designation, whatever you want to call it, number one, is a person that's in an immediate crisis. And like I said before, that's if you're suffering from homelessness, you had a sudden death of the primary caregiver. Otherwise, that individual is a threat to themselves or others. Again, they're not going to take just my word for it that they're a threat to themselves or another person. It's kind of a process. There needs to be a lot of documentation, a lot of interventions done before that, but you can definitely ask and they can give you a lot of tips and tricks and stuff like that to get your needs met, maybe using some outside services or getting the documentation that you need to get that priority one status.
And along those lines, similar questions that have come in from parents. My child is an at-risk child and needs an out-of-home placement immediately. Again, can DD services help with that?
They can help. Again, they can't move mountains. They're going to try to provide every effort to kind of keep that individual at home with home-based services. They want to try to reduce the number of youth placements. I always tell people reach out early. Don't wait until it gets to that out of control. So if you notice your individual or kiddo having some behaviors or becoming unmanageable at home, that you reach out early. There's some programs that kind of help modify that behavior that they can address before you get to that, I need this individual placed out of the home. So they're going to make you exhaust all those services and whatnot first, but they can help and provide some guidance.
So how do I find qualified service providers who can be paid through the waiver to work with my child? Like, I want to find people I can trust. It's very important to me.
Kind of like looking for a daycare. DHHS has a list of registered community agencies and independent workers on their website. So you can explore those. Then I suggest, going out to those community agencies or meeting with those independent providers. asking for references, kind of talking to other members of the community of maybe on who they use to provide services. I would first check out the list of registered community and independent providers on the website.
Still on the providers. So can my child's family members become respite providers or independent family service providers?
They can. They, just like everybody else, need to become an independent provider with DHHS. They're going to need to meet the criteria, just like any other provider, to be able to do that. There is an application, there's a background check and a process that needs to be completed, but a family member can apply to do that.
Can parents be paid as our child's respite provider or independent family service provider? We often get that question too.
Oh, the ever so asking question. And it's kind of difficult because we are a different kind of parent before the age of 19 in the state of Nebraska, as to it kind of differentiates after the age of 19, where we're not responsible for our child in the same regards anymore. Yes, you can be paid as your child's respite provider or independent family service provider. But with that being said, you cannot be their guardian at the same time. So you cannot be the person responsible for them and then their provider. So you would need to designate that separately.
Still on providers, is there a shortage of qualified providers in Nebraska right now?
Absolutely. Just like everywhere else. Everywhere has a now hiring sign. So yes, unfortunately, there is a shortage.
There's so many pieces to finding out about state services, what adult services. We often get questions with SSI. So is SSI related to Medicaid waivers or DD services at all? Same, different?
They're all separate programs, but meeting the Social Security disability requirement makes it a lot easier to access the state services. So if you are declared disabled by Social Security, you will automatically qualify for Medicaid. You just get this handy dandy little letter that says, yeah, you now have Medicaid. And then that Social Security designation of a disability can assist you in waiver eligibility and kind of get rid of a lot of that red tape. So it's related. They kind of all work in a big circle, but they're not the same thing.
We've gotten some parents, when we ask them, what have you applied for? Sometimes they're all lumped together and they shouldn't be. Like you need to know what was actually applied for, like DD or like the waiver, SSI. And so it's good to know. And again, no questions are dumb. So if you're not sure what you applied for, just go check, ask.
Yeah. Oftentimes everybody needs all of them. They all fulfill a different, need in the bucket. So some people will be like, well, I don't need Social Security. Well, sometimes you do need Social Security to qualify for Medicaid to receive your DD waiver. So really you do need that. So
right.
Kind of a circle.
Yeah, absolutely. So what if I move to another state? Does my DD services in Nebraska transfer to another state?
No, the waivers that we talked about today are state waivers, and eligibility and service requirements vary state to state. So when you move to a new state, you unfortunately have to reapply and see if you meet the eligibility in that state.
And I've heard about person-centered planning. So what does that have to do with DD services and Medicaid waivers, if anything?
So person-centered planning is awesome. It's a great tool to use during transition. And it kind of just helps you see and explore how all these supports and different services work together, to plan for your future, to live out your dreams. DHHS uses a program called Charting the Life Course. And it's, created to help you develop a vision for what your individual's good life is. And so it kind of helps us identify what supports that we think our individual needs. If you flip to the next slide, I think it'll show you one of the worksheets. And this is a personal strengths and assets worksheet. And it's kind of showing you, like eligibility specific. So those are government paid services, how we're going to fill those in the community, What kind of technology do we need to be able to live, work, and play independently? And what other relationships outside of those government supports have we formed that can maybe fill in the gaps where those services may not work or we don't have the funding for? So it's just a really good tool to plan for your future, especially transitioning from the educational system to the adult work independent life system.
We'll give some person-centered planning information handouts when we send you the information afterwards. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So appeal process.
So this is just the general information that we wanted to include about the appeal process and where to send it and how it's done. Like I said, explore your options, reapply at least once before you start the appeal process. But this is just the information in case you need it.
Did you mention it earlier? Was there a time frame that you should appeal?
Normally it's 30 days. So I just had a family reach out last week that says, oh, I want to appeal my child's DD denial. We applied last year. No, wrong answer.
Right.
But you can start over and reapply. But you do need to start the appeal process promptly after the denial.
That is great to know. We made it to the end. Thank you, everyone, for sticking in there. We hope you have a wonderful night.